Assalamu alaikum, Grüß Gott, und guten Tag, and hello to Cairo. I would love to be with you in Cairo right now, but I have to be in school here in Bavaria. You probably know Bavaria, it's in Germany, it's the place where we have the Oktoberfest right now. And thank you for engaging in education for the future. And we think it's really true. We youth, we have to fight against climate change. And thank you for being interested in our perception of future and watching the film Weil ich länger lebe als du. When you are gone, I'll still be there. I think it'll show you a little how we children think and see the future. Because we children, we see one main problem. In a few years when we are in power and we'll have to live with all the problems the adults have not solved today, we won't be able to take the adults to account for the problems they have not solved, as they will probably be dead by then. If this wasn't the case, most adults would probably act quite differently. In we children, we also see two main crises. The poverty crisis and the climate crisis. The poverty crisis, with 30,000 people, mainly children, dying of starvation every single day. And 1/2 of the world's population living with less than $2 a day. And all that in an incredibly rich world. And the climate crisis. Every day we take as much carbon out of the ground as it took 1 million days for the sun to store it there. Carbon in form of coal, gas, and oil. We children, we understand that the adults know all these crises. But we don't understand why there is so little action. Is it the perception of future? For most adults, future seems to mean 20, 30, or even 40 years. But for many of us children, 2100 is still in our lifetime. And therefore, it's an academic question for most adults. If the sea level will rise by 1, 2, or 3 centimeters, or 7 meters until some time. But for many of us children, it's a question of survival. And if you let a monkey choose if he wants 1 banana now or 6 bananas later, the monkey will always choose the 1 banana now. And it seems that many of the adults think a little like these monkeys. And for us children, it also seems like for most adults, 9/11 is the darkest day in history. But for us children, 12/11 is the darkest day in history. At the last climate conference in Durban, the most recent conference, because adults are discussing about our future at these climate conferences since 17 years. And at the most recent such conference in Durban, there was a very simple goal: to get a follow-up protocol for the Kyoto Protocol, which ends this year. But instead of making a contract which starts at the beginning of next year, the governments decided that there should only be a contract in 2020. That means that in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, all the countries can exhaust unlimited amounts of CO2. And that means that the promise the adults gave us since decades, the 2 degrees promise, is impossible to reach. But this promise is incredibly important. If the scientists tell us if the temperature rises by about 2.3 or 2.4 degrees, then the Greenland ice will melt completely and the sea level will rise by 7 meters. And nobody knows what that means. And at our academies, we learn a very simple memory hook. If we don't want the temperature to rise by more than 2 degrees, then we're not allowed to exhaust more than 2 tons of CO2 per person per year. And if we don't want the temperature to rise by more than 1.5 degrees, then we're not allowed to exhaust more than 1.5 tons of CO2 per person per year. But today, we're exhausting 6 tons per person in average. And nobody knows what that means. But if we go on that way until 2020, until we have that contract, we might have set the stage for 5 degrees plus. No one knows what that means, but once, when it was 5 degrees colder, we had 2 kilometers of ice over us here. And at this last climate conference in Durban, the environment minister of Canada stood up and gave a speech. And during his speech, 6 of us youth stood up as well and turned around, and on the back it said, "Turn your back to Canada." They were thrown out of the conference hall. They were thrown out of the conference. And a few days later, the Canadian Environment Minister arrived home and reported that Canada will step out of the Kyoto Protocol. Because according to the Kyoto Protocol, they should have reduced their emissions by 6%. But instead of that, they increased their emissions by 35%. And because of that, they should have paid a fine of $14 billion. But to save that money, they decided to step out of the Kyoto Protocol. Does that mean our future isn't even worth $14 billion? What is our future worth? And at the last sustainability conference, Rio Plus 20, the adults celebrated 20 years of sustainability. But we children didn't think there was anything to celebrate, because in these 20 years, nearly nothing happened. But what is sustainability? Just about a year ago, we talked to one of the indigenous people from North America, and he told us that in their group, every time just before they make a decision, they think if even the 7th generation after them would support this decision, and only then they would agree and do it. And the word sustainability originally comes from the foresters. Next year there will be the anniversary of 300 years sustainability, Nachhaltigkeit. It comes from the foresters because all their life what they are doing is planting trees. They plant trees all their lives, although they themselves don't have an advantage of it. But the next generations do. And they live of the trees the generations before them have planted. And that's where the sustainability comes from. And today, we have companies that just talk about sustainability all the time just to sell more products. We children think that if there's income generated without sustainability, there needs to be 100% tax on that income. And at this sustainability conference, the first sustainability conference in Rio, there was a girl about my age, she spoke there. And everything she said over 20 years ago at that conference could have been repeated at this conference this year. Because in that time, nearly nothing changed. But we see one positive thing. In these last years, since there's YouTube, she got about 20 million clicks on YouTube. But there are examples today of movies that get 20 million clicks in 2 days. So we children think it is possible. We have an advantage through the internet, a huge advantage. And we children understand we can only solve these problems if we work together worldwide. And this is why we organize academies, one-day workshops, at which we children educate other children that they can also participate. And in the meantime, we have already empowered over 15,000 children and youth at these academies. And we children, we also made consultations, thinking about what would we do if we were the heads of governments of the world. And we ended up with a 3-point plan. The first point is planting trees. Our goal is to plant 1 trillion trees. This is the amount of trees we can plant on this earth without having problems with making food and so on. And if every person in the world plants 150 trees, we can make this. We can plant 1 trillion trees. And if we plant them, they will absorb 1/3 of the global CO2 emissions. They will absorb 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. The second point is that until 2050, from 2050 on, we have to go down to 0 emissions. We just have to leave carbon. We just have to leave the carbon in the ground. And the great thing is that all the technology we need for that already exists today. We don't have to find out more. We already have the technology. And then there's the third and last point. Until that time, there's a limited amount of CO2 we can still exhaust. And this is 1.5 tons per person a year. And if someone wants to exhaust more, then they pay to the ones that exhaust less. And this is what we call climate justice. And we can also do something against the poverty crisis. So every person in the world needs to plant 150 trees. This is our message to everyone. So have fun watching the movie today.